All right, we have 2 minutes past the hour. I know that we've got some folks still coming in, but I think we will get going. Kels, I don't know if we have enough of who have taken part in the poll to be able to close that so we can see what the results are. If we have enough, you can close and show us the results. If you think there are still a few more coming in, you can leave it open as I am just getting started. We do have a few folks still coming in. Also want to mention that we are going to be actively watching the chat window, and we welcome all participants. Please let us know your questions and comments as well. We do want to make sure that we are addressing those comments, and I'll ask and remind our panelists to keep an eye on that as well. And to the extent that you can work some of the questions and comments into your responses, please do so. So I want to take a quick look at the poll results. First of all, in terms of what type of learning model is being used at the district, we've got about a third doing hybrid, about half virtual, 20% at other. And then in terms of implementing SEL in your district, looks like 60% saying yes, and the other 40% planning, which is really interesting. To me, that more or less is aligned with what we are seeing as well. So we're going to keep that in mind as we get going in our discussion. All right, 4 minutes past the hour. Kels, you can take down the poll results. Thanks very much. Folks, I'll give some quick introductions. My name is John Watson. I'm with the Evergreen Education Group. Also run the Digital Learning Collaborative as well. We have 3 panelists joining us as well. They're gonna be talking about their own backgrounds. I'll just very, very quickly introduce them. Stacy Gonzalez is with a district outside of Chicago in Illinois. Yvonne Metcalf is with Strong Mind, which is a company based in Arizona. And Dan Milan runs the Hybrid Valor School on the west side of the Phoenix metro area. We are here to talk, by the way, as I mentioned earlier, for those who join later on, I am based in Western Colorado. We are here to talk about social emotional learning. I think it's pretty clear, and it comes through based on those poll results, that while social emotional learning has been recognized for many years, and I think in an increasing way, that it's critical to students' well-being, to students' development as well. It's also become really, really clear during the pandemic, during the time of remote learning and hybrid learning, that SEL has been more important than ever, not just because of new instructional modes, but also because essentially everybody is facing issues related to the pandemic that are new in our lifetimes, luckily, and hopefully we're not going to experience them again. SEL, because of that, has become really, really front and center. At the same time, to the extent that there's a silver lining to all this, and I hesitate to mention a silver lining around a pandemic that's claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, but I think there's no question that the pandemic has had some silver linings. I think one is that it has shown a light on inequities within society. It's shown a light on the many ways that public schools and private schools play such a central role to so many students and families, whether it's a custodial role, whether it's providing food and nutrition to so many students. All of these areas, all these things have been really, really critical. One of these other areas that I think has been underappreciated in the past is the way that individual teachers and schools and districts support the mental health of students, how they think about the variety of ways that students need to grow, need to develop in ways that go beyond just pure academics. That has become, as I said earlier, front and center during the pandemic. One of the things, as we're at this very interesting point in time when COVID cases are still surging, the spike is still happening at the same time with the vaccines now rolling out, I think it's safe to say we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And we're at a point where a lot of educators that we speak with are starting to think about, okay, what comes next? What can we take that we have learned, that we have implemented over the last, well, it's been about 10 months now, going back to March of 2020. What are the things that we can take, learn from, and perhaps be able to take into the rest of this school year, especially as school returns to something that's similar to back to normal, and into future years as well. So that's what we're going to be talking about. I'm going to be putting a series of questions to our panelists. And as I have mentioned, we will be looking for comments from the audience as well. I see already a mention of someone who's teaching ELA to middle school virtually in New York. Love to hear those comments. That really helps us be able to tailor our comments. So to those who are out there, please do let us know where you are, what you're doing, what you're thinking. It's going to make this discussion a whole lot better tailored to what you're all thinking about. I do want to start with each of you. I'll start with Stacy, go to Giovanni, and then Dan, starting with just a brief overview to set the stage. How does your district, in the case of Stacy, school in the case of Dan, company in the case of Giovanni, how does your organization define and characterize SEL, and what is your role? So Stacy, I'm going to start with you. Tell us about D230 and your role and what you're thinking about with SEL.
Great, thank you. Super excited to be here, and thanks to everyone who's putting some pieces in the comments. I think that's a really important question for us to think about is how do we define SEL? So I sit at the district level. My role is to work with our assistant principals of instruction in our division chairs. We're about 8,000 high school students, about 30 minutes south of Chicago. And so one of the ways in which I think about SEL is really overarching, because I have the privilege of sitting at the more top of the organization. I have a finger on my pulse of many things. And I think it starts with, for me, where's our staff? So one of the things, like if, for instance, this was any sort of staff, and everything's virtual, right? Or with our staff as we're getting together. So if this were something that I were doing with our staff, I would say to them, the first thing I would ask them is, how are you doing today? On a scale of 1 to 5, 5, like I'm rocking, I'm hitting it, I'm feeling great. 1 being like, I'm not really feeling it today. So what I'm going to ask you to do is what I model with my staff, and it's pretty simple, and you could do this with your students. It's just a real easy way to check in and see where people are at, because we're on this webinar format, we don't have the visual. So that's the first thing I would ask. So open your chat box, let us know where you're feeling or how you're feeling. Right, and we're going to see people are going to be all over the place, and that's okay, and that's exactly where we're at. And we might be all 5s today, so that will keep it leveled up real high for you. So that's how I think about it from that top-down leadership to staff approach. And then with our students, by modeling some of those things like this little activity I just did now, we really take the social emotional piece with our students really seriously, and it looks very different now that we're post-COVID. And I know we're going to spend some time talking about what that looks like, but for me, it really is about the entire organization embracing this idea of both social emotional learning and individual. I'd also add individual wellness, like really, how are we making sure we're well during a time when it is just really hard? So, and thank you, John Watson, for reminding us of the people who use decimal points in their responses.
Precise, but not necessarily accurate. Stacy, you've brought up a great point that we're going to circle back to, which is there's this distinction, I think, between SEL as you think about how is it applied at a district level or school level or a teacher level. How do you then apply that or think about that individually, because ultimately we're talking about something that, just as you referenced, is individual state or status for each person, for each teacher, for each student. Super interesting to me that in the chat window, Tim Duncan mentioned that SEL is an initiative being instilled by the Virginia Department of Ed. I love these webinars because I always get to learn something. A lot of times it's from the panelists and it's from the attendees as well. I know that DOEs are involved in this, but I hadn't heard somebody say that so directly. So that's really interesting. And actually, Tim, love to hear more in the chat window about, hey, what does that look like? Maybe that might be something that we can speak to as well. Before we get into some of these things that you've raised, Stacey, I'm going to go to Giovanni next. Giovanni, if you could tell us a little bit about StrongMind and who you're working with, and what does SEL mean to StrongMind?
Opa. Thank you, John, and thanks, Stacey. So StrongMind is an education technology company that has been developing and managing online schools for the last 2 decades. And in that time, we've learned a lot about what helps students to be successful, what in both inside the academics of the classroom and outside the academics of the classroom. One of the things that is very known is that online education, virtual education is significantly different. It's a different learning experience, and it requires a different skill set than classroom learning. And so one of the things that we have attempted to address is those social and emotional skills that students needed in order to be successful when there isn't a teacher in front of them, when they aren't necessarily able to go to school and learn those social norms that they would be inundated with and surrounded with in a traditional academic environment. And so after doing a lot of research on what different factors to increase academic achievement, SEL became very evident that it was a serious skill that we needed to reinforce amongst students, but also help teacher support and help facilitate what was not naturally occurring, those teachable moments that you have when you're with a student for an hour straight and with a bunch of students for an hour straight. So we set out to develop a solution that took into account the many barriers that made SEL sustainable in a traditional classroom, and really researched how to make it sustainable and actually achievable within a virtual and blended environment. And so it is something that we are very proud to say that we align with CASEL competencies, and we have put a lot of research, so much so that it is a research, it has a digital promise research-backed certification. It is one of the only SEL products to claim as such, and we felt that was incredibly important, given that this is something that we really cannot risk doing incorrectly.
Thanks, Giovanni, and I like the fact that you raised the CASEL standards in response to my request. Tim Duncan in the chat window mentioned that the Virginia DOE is using CASEL as well. We're going to touch on those certainly a little bit further. Before we do that, so Dan, Stacey Gonzalez comes to us from a mainstream district doing a lot of really innovative work around digital, but at least pre-COVID, kids were mostly showing up every day. So that, that was mostly a way to think about SEL that was face-to-face, again, at least pre-COVID. Giovanni at StrongMind, they're doing a lot with virtual, so kids and teachers at a distance. Valer's hybrid. Can you tell us about, first of all, just give us a quick overview about what does it mean to be a hybrid school, and then how do you think about SEL within that setting?
Sure. So yeah, we are a hybrid school. So our version of hybrid, because it can take a whole lot of forms. For us, hybrid means really that part of our content is delivered online, and then it is supported, remediated. It is, the fires are lit by our teachers on site. Our students come to school from 8 to 12 every day. They're required to be here. And then we are here throughout the day, the rest of the day, to support them. We run tutoring in the afternoon, or we meet with clubs and just kind of grow the learning from them at that point. So that is our version of hybrid. And Yeah, so we have roughly 90 students here at Valor, and we continue to grow. And yeah, and so really, our teachers will meet with the students 2 days a week, face to face. They'll be doing online work every day, and actually we use StrongMind as a matter of fact. And so they will be doing their online work throughout the day, but they will meet with the teachers, and they'll run station rotation in the classroom where the teachers can kind of get higher levels of depth of knowledge and kind of applying what they've learned. So, and your next question is, what does SEL look like here? It's kind of baked into our instructional model. If you were to look at our instructional model, it has knowledge at the top, the acquiring of knowledge, certainly that we get that through StrongMind. And then we have skills on the right-hand side, the 4 C's, project-based learning, those kinds of things. Then if you go down the right-hand side, we have technology infused. So obviously, if we're running an online program, the kids get their core knowledge from there. That's how they get their tech. Personalized learning, and then on the left, flexibility. And then our last one is empowerment. Schools will call them dispositions, empowerments, mindsets, things like that, that kind of drive the students, that those internal motors that keeps the students moving. We can't live without all those things being connected by SEL. If you look at the Castle competencies, then those are what are kind of inside every piece of those, and really are what holds it all together. As we built the schedule, we knew we had to build time to focus on those empowerments on the top left, but also to build in SEL time. And I think we'll talk about how that fits into the school later, but that's how it lives in our school.
Thank you, Dan. And I have so many questions that I'm going to follow up in some more detail momentarily. One of the things, I'll share with all the attendees, the background that we at Evergreen and Digital Learning Collaborative have is around online blended hybrid learning. SEL has certainly been part of that, but for most of the time we've been in this space, it's not been a major focus. It's been more of a focus, I think, for everybody in the digital learning space, and perhaps across all of K-12 education more recently, for all the reasons I mentioned in the opening. When I look at things like the Castle definition, I'll go a little bit deeper into that momentarily, but when we look at things like that, one of the things that strikes me is, okay, that sounds like what good teachers did when I was in school several centuries ago, but not necessarily everybody. And so part of the question I have is around how you think about systematizing some of these efforts. And Dan, you talked about that a little bit. You started down that path. I actually want to go back to Stacy and hear about how a mainstream district thinks about that before I come back to you, Dan. So Stacy, can you talk about that? Like, we know that the best teachers are going to do a really good job about connecting with their students and being able to take that time. Some of them are more experienced. They've got a greater comfort level for perhaps in instructional methods and the academic material so that they can put that time in. But how as a district do you make sure that that's happening really starting at that baseline foundational level?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially when we're talking 8,000 students, right? 500 staff members. So our approach has really been that everybody in the organization is responsible for SEL, especially since we've been in a hybrid model. So one of the things, for example, we've done is teams of adult learner, like adults, whether you're a cafeteria worker, whether you are, it does not necessarily matter your role in the organization, but starting by helping all of our adults understand what social connections and emotional supports mean for kids in a virtual environment. So, and what are the high touch points and what are the low touch points? So really kind of getting clear on what that is, making sure that every kid is identified and has a adult contact who is checking in with him or her, depending on the level of if the student's coming to school or not. So really getting clear on what's important to us and how we value that, and then empowering all our staff, as opposed to just putting it on the counseling staff, or to your point, the teachers that, this is more natural for. So building out opportunities for all staff to be engaged, part of that through some formal structures, And then part of that through some informal structures that teachers can participate in with relative to like book studies, webinars like this, things that teachers can be a part of so that if they aren't comfortable, because it's not an option, like this is important. All of our students also have one period a day and they have it every day. We call it an advisory period. And so that advisory period is really focused on not only, some of the other pieces, but pre-COVID, we had maybe more flexibility around, we could be talking about college or career planning or whatever. We really dedicated once COVID hit, and then especially starting this year, that time was going to be really kind of coveted to ensure that our students have an adult who is working directly with the student around his or her social and emotional needs.
Stacey, I want to dig into this a little bit further because if I understand you, what you're saying is that every student has an adult who they identify in this role. Is that accurate? Who are those adults? Teachers? Are they counselors? Are they somebody else? And what are they called? What would a student say? I am meeting with my blank. Who is that?
Advisory okay. Teacher.
Yeah.
It may not be teacher, but advisor. We
Yeah.
use the term advisor because nobody else in our organization is called advisors. We have counselors, we have social workers, we have whatever. So my advisor.
Yeah.
And that advisor's role is really to listen hard and to figure out whether it's the student is dealing with, relational matters, whether the student is dealing with, some social struggle or whatever that is. And then if it's beyond the capabilities of the advisor, then the advisor knows where to level up within the organization and the support systems that we've built out.
And final question, these advisors are all teachers who are also in this role, or they may be something else, or what is
maybe
that?
Yeah, maybe something else. Pre-COVID, they were all teachers.
Yeah.
But post-COVID, we realized that we need more manpower, right? We need more people to help people, but we also have to make sure that those people are adequately prepared. So, we've tapped into other individuals within the organization to help provide those supports. And they that want to, like, we're not forcing anybody who's not comfortable, or right, but people want to.
Yeah. So interesting the way you're talking about this, and what I said earlier was about how this was this kind of process was informal, and now what we're talking about is formalizing. And I'm actually, as you're talking, I'm having flashbacks. When I was in high school, I got very, very ill, very seriously ill, and it affected my performance. I had a biology teacher who knew that, and for whatever reason, he was the only teacher who knew that, and he was that person to me. And it was completely informal, but he was incredibly valuable in all sorts of ways. And those are the sorts of things I hear you and District 230 being able to formalize. Dan, what does this look like at Valor, at a hybrid school?
Yeah, so boy, the question's so good, and so what Stacey hit on was a lot of what we realized we had to do when we looked at the structure. So I took over in July, spent 30 years in public ed out in Pennsylvania, and I think so much of this was left to the counselors, and the rest of us just kind of taught academics. I did Spanish, and that day, I believe, has gone by. I think COVID, if anything, has shown us that we have to put that in a different place now. And as you said, it was up to the Herculean efforts of some amazing teachers along the way, unless of course you didn't have one of those, and then it would just miss. So that disparate kind of implementation is what we wanted to avoid. I know when I took over in July, I got to set the schedule for Valor and kind of look at the way it was set. So I like what Stacey was describing. I blocked out the 40 minutes every morning to say, okay, this time is for a soft landing for our kids. It's to work on our empowerments, and it's to work on what was going to be our SEL at the time, and now is currently our SEL. It's when we implement those things. But for us, when we realize that the counselor isn't going to be the sole provider of SEL in the district anymore, then we have to talk about how we raise the floor each time of vocabulary, of knowledge, of the competencies that are required, because nobody's trained in this but the counselors, really. So the counselors are deep into this, and the rest of us we knew from our own experience, we knew intuitively, good teachers knew intuitively what to do, but not really trained. So what we were looking for here at Valor was the ability to start with a new floor and every time raise that floor up, not just with one teacher, but with every teacher, so that when someone uses, we get a new set of vocab, that permeates the entire school culture. So, for example, we started with self-awareness. That is what we'll focus on for a week or two, unless we have another topic that, that pops up that we have to. So we'll go through well, I'll describe how we go through in a little bit, but we can stagger it. We have a system that allows that floor to raise each time. And it looks like, for us, it looks like this. 2 days a week, the students will go through, we use StrongMind, and StrongMind produce StrongMinded, which are these online, they're activities. They have an animated section at the beginning, and then which ranges from middle school to high school. I could go lower, actually. And so they address the CASEL competencies, and then the next day we let it sit, because that's what we do. Our model is to be flexible, so we know we have to offer it in modality, so they can do the entire piece online, whether at home or they do it during their independent time for us. And then when we get face to face, that's when we dig in. That's when we do the magic that each teacher does. And the really good ones, we're doing it intuitively. But now we have every teacher at this floor of vocabulary and floor of knowledge that gets to raise up each time. And it's, so that cadence is how we move through things. 2 days of online, getting the floor raised up, and then 1 day of deep kind of getting in with the kids each time, and really digging into what the humans do well with other humans, which is connect, understand, grow. Those pieces online just can't do. No matter how good it is, you need the human interaction afterwards. So, and that's our cadence, and that's how we've created this. School counselors are still unbelievably required. And my wife is a school counselor, as a matter of fact, and I have to go to her all the time. Like, listen, this topic's coming up. Help me walk through this one more time. But we have to be able to get to a spot where everybody in the school is using the same vocabulary. And for us, that just means kind of moving through this cadence of online, face-to-face, online, face-to-face talk.
Yeah, if I can jump in on that, I think what Dan said is so key, in that developing a common nomenclature is crucial to building a socially connected, emotionally supportive culture in your organization, whatever that looks like. Because if I'm using the word self-regulation and you're using the word self-regulation, but we think it means two different things, or we don't really know what that looks like or sounds like or feels like, then we're not really aligned. And so it's like talking French and German to each other. So you hit on a really good point, and it sounds like what you've been able to do with StrongMind and through that program is to be able to reinforce what those words that we're using around the language really mean, because that takes time too, right? Building common language over time, it just takes time.
Yeah.
Giovanni, I'm going to go to you to comment on some of this. I think both Stacy and Dan have been bringing up some points that I think you might want to comment on. A couple of points before we do that. One is I'll mention to all our participants that we are at halfway through our time. Some really good comments in there, but please do get your questions in if you've got any questions that you'd like to put to folks, to make sure that we can get to them. I'll also mention, before going to Giovanni, really interesting, I think, to consider the ways that teachers and other adults can connect with students. And there are, in my experience, what we hear about is some students who do need that face-to-face, but then some other students who really blossom through online, even in areas related to SEL. A quick story about this, my wife's a university professor. After having taught entirely face-to-face for many, many, many years, she started teaching an online course for the first time several years ago. And in that online course, she asked all her students to record a very short video. She said, record a video, you're gonna post it for everybody. Tell me why you're taking this course, just tell me a little bit about yourself. And I remember this was about 4 years ago. When she did this, she came to me and said, I am blown away by what students are recording. and what they're telling me. And part of, first of all, she said, I now know these students, and I was about to call them kids, but they're not. This is a university that has everything from 18-year-olds to 50-year-olds taking classes. But she said, blown away by what they're sharing. It's different now with what students will share through a video, share for everybody. And she said, and I know these students way better than I ever knew the 100 kids in my lecture hall. In fact, the next year she started having, when she went back to face for the fall semester, she had all her students record a video the same way, because there was no way she was ever going to understand those students in those ways. So there are these different modes of communication. I think that they have advantages and disadvantages, and some of those are specific to each student. Yvonne, you've been listening to a lot of these comments, and I know StrongMind has been thinking about a lot of this, both with the fully online schools that you work with, and as well as some of the hybrid schools that you support. What are your thoughts in relation to some of what we're hearing from Dan and Stacy?
I love that. I love that Dan and Stacy are talking about how they're supporting individual students, but also raising the floor as a whole. I love that analogy. And that's definitely what we sought to do with StrongMinded, is raising the floor as a whole, because oftentimes self-awareness, social awareness, these are not necessarily skills that are explicitly taught to teachers about how to teach students these things. And so we realized there was going to need to be a lot more structures in place that would allow them to demystify these conversations and create that shared understanding of what social awareness looks like when you're teaching a 6th grader versus a 9th grader versus a 12th grader. These are a continuum. This is a continuous competency that we're having to develop over and over again as we grow older and as the world around us becomes more complex and demands more of us. And so while we're starting off with these competencies and we're starting off with this floor that all teachers, all users of our program are able to tap into, what it looks like individually for students can differ. So for if Dan has a student, if Johnny needs something different from Jimmy, who needs something different from Jose, we want that to happen. It's one of the benefits of relying on technology this way to personalize the education, even if we're asking teachers to do something above and beyond just teaching the ELA or the math standards that are going to be tested at the end of the year. So for Johnny's going to need something in time management, and Jose may need something in self-regulation. And that needs to be okay, and it needs to not take such a Herculean effort. It also needs to be relevant to students and teachers. And so what we've allowed is for teachers to go through one lesson or one playlist that is bite-sized with the class and creates that opportunity to talk about this as a group. We've also created the opportunity to say, hey, Johnny, here's where we're going to start with self-regulation. And we're going to start here, and by the end of this, we're going to talk about this, and we're going to end up in this spot. And so all of these competencies are broken down into grade specific learning objectives that build on each other over time. And it provides that opportunity for the explicit instruction that needs to be available and needs to happen in order for social and emotional learning to take the priority that it needs to help students be successful academically and just in life in general.
John, I know you're the moderator, but can I piggyback off of, please, I'm raising my hand, because Ivani said something that is so poignant, and that I think about when I have so many teachers, right? And I know I've got teachers that are just trying to figure out how to use the tools. So to be able to, and they're not bad teachers, it's not that, but like to add SEL and to ask a teacher who just isn't there yet for whatever reason. So sometimes you have to kind of bypass. And so what it sounds like you're doing with StrongMinded is you're getting that access directly to the student. Not that the teacher can be completely involved, teach the lesson, but there are times when to bypass is really important. And I've seen that in such a large organization. And so I really just wanted to key in on how that's really valuable.
A fun fact, Stacy, right out of the box, we're seeing students who are taking hold of that self-agency, and they're exploring all of these factors about themselves, and they're using the tool above and beyond what the one lesson their teacher assigned to them. And the completion rates are actually, the vast majority of students, they're completing these lessons and these modules, despite the fact they're not connected to like their test grade later this week. They're using, and they're choosing topics and content that's relevant to them and what they need, which is actually, it's pretty amazing to see.
What you're both talking about, and yes, Stacy, I'm completely good with you jumping in on with these comments. I really appreciate them. What you are, part of what you're talking about, in part, sounds very similar, or adding to what Dan was mentioning about that foundation, that floor earlier. It also, to me, echoes what I touched on at the start of this session around the idea that maybe this is a silver lining to the pandemic. You know, I was really struck the early days, March, April last year, especially March. I was really struck by, I was simultaneously having some conversations with some policy folks in states where the discussion was, are we doing state assessments this year? Which, you know, now kind of seems ridiculous, but that was the discussion in the second half of March last year. And so I would have this just jarring disjointedness where I'd come off a phone where a policy person was talking about, are we having state assessments? And then I'd be talking with somebody in a school or district and say, hey, what do you think about what's going on? Like, we're figuring out how to get food to our kids, right? And, you know, are state assessments on your mind? Yeah, not really. And for really, really good reason. And that to me is just this very, very small element of how we think about the full needs of students and families. And I think the changes that have happened over the last year, I'm hopeful, have made a lot more people, especially outside the education system, aware of all those. I want to shift a little bit to something that, Ivana, you talked about that put this on my head. You mentioned time management and self-regulation among students. I do think that I tend to fall back on SEL, thinking about things like mental health, emotional health, things like that. But I'm reminded of the CASEL definition of SEL when you were talking, and the CASEL definition is the process through which all young people acquire and apply knowledge, skills, attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. Like everything in addition to academics. And that's kind of what you were just referencing, Stacy. I want to, Stacy, I will actually go back to you to talk about your district. So can you talk a little bit more about all these things? I mean, those things probably have like 100 subcategories, right? So there's a lot of them, and a lot of them do have to do with these, you know, in other contexts, they're maybe called executive skills. They're things that we know are incredibly valuable and necessary for students. And I know you're in a high school district, especially as we think about the transition of students from high school into career or college. How do you think about those things in this context of everything else that you've already mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, if you said to me, what do you think is the most important, right? If like you had to boil it down to one word or one thing, I would say it's communication. If the communication, how is that SEL, right? How does that function within SEL? Well, all of those things, whether you're communicating to another person how you're feeling, whether you're having to communicate like what you're learning, how you're applying those skills, how you're not being able to utilize them. Like for me, the way I'm thinking about, right, agency, to Ivani's point, right? Like self-agency, student agency, we want them to take ownership and go above and beyond. But then I want you to communicate with me how you're doing that. See, those are the links. I want our teachers to communicate back with us what they're seeing is working, what's not working, as we are developing out our programming around our SEL competencies. So for me, like if I had to umbrella it, it really is about this need for dialogue, which then goes back to building that common culture nomenclature that we really want in our schools and for our kids. So I don't know if that hit exactly on where you were going. It's more something that I've been thinking, spending a lot of time on, especially because for schools, communication is difficult, right? You've got some kids at home, some kids at school, some teachers at home, right? Like the mode by which we ensure these structures work is by having solid communication channels. And so that kind of, for me, frames all of it out, being really, really clear on how we're communicating, who we're communicating with, when we're doing it, and the expectations around that.
And during the pandemic, that's been extra difficult for a lot of the districts with kids who are remote. There are students who have become disengaged. They're hugely challenging. At the same time, part of what you're referencing, Stacy, is the idea that again, very early days of the pandemic, I think there was a process by which, again, more at the policy level and maybe the district leadership level in some districts, not yours, clearly, where teachers had to be assured that the right thing to do is connect with your students. Don't worry about chapter 12. That's not what you're doing right now. You're making sure that your kids are feeling safe to the extent, I'm not sure anybody felt safe in March and April, but as much as possible that you're connecting with them and all those issues that you're talking about, that was front and center.
And there's an added element, right? So I'll take an example of a physics teacher who spends the first 10 minutes doing either a mindfulness activity or an identification of your feelings, where you at right now, just different things. And so there's a couple things with that. When you're virtual, like your parents, listen, Gen Zers are used to helicopter parenting. That is just the reality. So there are, when you're in this, to Dan, who's been in this virtual world, he knows parents are in the background, but for our public schools, this is new, like parents listening into everything. And so I've got, what comes to mind as a physics teacher who's getting positive emails from parents saying, thank you for taking this time to do these, to format this, to take out the 10 minutes of the day of the lesson. That we're seeing the rewards of that from even our parents. And what's even cooler about that, right? Because many would argue these are the skills that should be taught in the home. Like if they didn't learn it from their parents, well, so that's especially high school teachers. High school teachers, we like our content, we want to teach our stuff. But the reality is it's so complex and we need more, we don't have the training around it. So we're also, by proxy, educating our parents, the ones that are our helicopter hovering parents, which is also a cool thing to kind of get some feedback on, and we're kind of hearing about.
Yeah. Again, you're making a lot of interesting points. We're familiar with some of that pushbacks that's happened in some places around role of parents versus what the school and teachers do. And yeah, I think that's been echoed in lots of other subject areas over the year. It's not new with SEL, and I would argue it's not a reason at all to shy away from that. And I think that's exactly what you're saying. Dan, I'm going to go to you in a moment to talk more about this question about executive skills, time management, those sorts of things. Before I do that, I'll just mention that I see this running commentary in the chat window around resources, and Strongmind has some that they'll be sending out, as well as Denise just posted the Castle website, which has some resources as well. Of course, in addition to some additional things that Strongmind is able to provide also. Dan, I want to go back to you. Time management, executive skills. What does that look like in Valor?
So when you when your content is delivered in the online format, regardless of how you're doing it, those skills are essential. And actually the entire model is built on that. Since the idea of Valor is that we're aiming for
Did I just lose Dan, or did everybody lose Dan? Okay, everybody lost Dan, at least momentarily. Yvonne, I'm going to go to you to talk. You touched on this earlier, but the history of StrongMind, thinking about SEL and how you thought about that. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about thinking about SEL pre-pandemic, now the work that StrongMind has done with online schools and with hybrid schools, of course, has been front and center for essentially every district in the country for the last year. What do you think this looks like going forward into as the pandemic is hopefully ending, as we're hopefully getting to the point where things will be going back to some sort of normal, but maybe not the same normal that we had pre-COVID?
Yeah, John, that's a really great question. Pre-pandemic, it almost felt like it was cutting edge almost to say you were adopting SEL standards or you were implementing a school-wide SEL program. I think now what we've realized is that it is not a luxury. It is a necessity, and something that like actually very tangibly impacts students in ways that are going to get in the way of academics if a school is not addressing these social and emotional skills. I realize that being able to congregate in a room with 30 people and talk about the same things at the same time is probably going to be forever impacted. Like technology is going to be in it. And one of the great ways that one of the silver linings, so to speak, if there are any, is the realization that we are much more connected than we ever thought in the ways that we're struggling, in the ways that we're dealing with how to connect with one another, and the ways that technology is going to help bridge those gaps. And so with SEL, although we do support blended schools, it is still the technology is still the floor, and an amazing teacher in an amazing classroom is going to be the ceiling, or the lack of a ceiling, so to speak. And so with SEL, we're going to see more people talking about how to overcome these unexpected factors and what our role is in getting in being able to move forward together, and then getting what we need individually, because that is a serious part of those social and emotional skills, is being able to advocate for yourself and being able to understand what it is you need and prioritize that as a whole.
As you were talking much earlier in this session, Giovanni, and you just touched on this again, the idea that there's this idea that Dan and Stacy have talked about around, okay, we want to set a foundation and teachers can then go from there. I hear you talking in an interesting, related, but somewhat different way, which is you set this foundation so that it's a commonality for all students, but then there's this really deep level of individualized or personalized SEL for each student. And that strikes me as just incredibly important, because the heart of SEL is, what are the issues that I'm working on, whether it's something like I need to be better at time management, or it's my puppy just died, or it's I'm not feeling well, or I'm super excited because I just got accepted to college. You know, there's all these different things, and it couldn't be any more personal, right?
It can't. And the research-based principles that we know and we rely on for academic instruction, relevance in the classroom, relevance of the content of the subject matter, relevance to the student, relatability, those all definitely extend to social and emotional learning and those skills as well. And so the idea that A teacher is going to stand and deliver the same lesson on time management or goal setting to all 30 people, and all 30 people are going to be able to absorb that and go and practice it and be effective with it because they heard it all at the same time. We no longer have to rely on that a mode of delivery. We no longer have to rely on someone telling us what it is we need to value and we need to learn. And so that's where this self-agency, just in online learning in general, is so important. But that's where it really, really becomes special in social and emotional learning, is because it does become relevant and it does take on a new meaning of its own without having to be tied to whether or not a student is going to get an A or 4.0 or the special sticker on their diploma, which all very important things, but still this is just as important.
Yeah, and I'm going to jump in because we're young. SEL is young. The first peer-reviewed research study on emotional intelligence was 1990. The first IQ test was like something like 1905, right? Which goes to John's point about like, what are you doing for the testing? What are you doing? You guys at Strong Mind and Strong Minded are shifting an entire culture, because our kids can get the information that was traditionally taught that you could only get from a teacher. Like you could only get those things from a teacher, or maybe if you were really, really like, I'm excited, you're going to read a book and you're going to self-learn, but the landscape has changed. And so we're really early on and pivoting towards what this ability, you mentioned self-agency, beyond the classroom, right? That's why kids aren't able to leave home as quickly as they can. That's why, like, I know I've got a 17 and a 20-year-old. I said they're going to be here till 25 minimally. That's what the research said. It's different. And so just really kind of keeping those things in mind, that this is the real work and the work is shifting. And so for those pure intellectual purists who are uncomfortable with this, we're in a changing landscape.
Very, very true. Thank you, Stacy. Dan, you're back. Welcome back. We have 6 minutes left. Dan, I'm going to go back to you to just continue the comment that you were making when we lost you, just for a couple of minutes, and then we'll do a very quick lightning round closing. I'll go to each of you just to comment on what you would like to leave our audience with. But before I do that, Dan, to be honest, I have forgotten what you were saying when we lost you, but I'm hoping you remember and can pick that up.
More or less. Anyway, so our model is built on empowerment. I'm going to ignore that comment, John. I can try to. Our model is built on empowerment, and that empowers the parents, the kids, the students. And like you said, so because parents are, very focused on the academics, what's nice with the way we have set it up, and what's nice about this strong-minded piece is we create the floor so we know that everybody's on that same level, but all the modules are there below it. So imagine having YouTube. When kids look up stuff, when they look things up, they can look up anything they'd like along that continuum. Like we control which ones they're going to look at on a given day, but then after that, the library is theirs to kind of go through and see how they could get support. So the important part for us is that we empower our parents. If they want that kind of help, we can give it to them. If we empower the kids, then that's them saying, listen, I know my parents don't care about this, but it's important to me. I can dig in on my own and grow this as I need to grow it. And that's the kind of empowerment that Valor is built on. And, I know that's what we need to be able to, that's how most kids get their information now anyway. Go look it up, Google it. In our case, we've just controlled Google a little bit for them and put it in an SEL platform and in Valor.
Yeah, fantastic. All right. We are just about out of time. I want to give each of you a chance to weigh in with a 30-second comment about or so and what you'd like to leave our attendees with. Yvonne, I'm going to start with you.
Yes, thank you, John. If I could leave the attendees with anything, it's that it should not be a Herculean effort in order to support social emotional learning for students right now. It doesn't have to be. Teachers are everything. They are the ceiling, they're the enablers. And what we want to do is help make this relevant and personal for students, but also help equip them with the tools that they need in order to make this explicit and sustainable. Two things that continue to be obstacles in social and emotional learning, regardless of whether or not you're in a traditional classroom or an online classroom.
Thank you, Ivani. Dan.
Yeah, so for better or for worse, COVID has pulled the curtain back on education. They see, parents get to see all the struggles and all the good things that are happening. And for now, I mean, moving forward, I believe SEL, this kind of piece cannot be the province of counselors anymore. It's got to be admin, teachers, parents, everyone has got to be involved with this. And we need that new floor to do that and some systematized way to do it. And so just whatever your district is, whatever it is, finding a way to create a new way for them to say, this is our ground level. Your ceiling, your best teachers are still the ceiling super high. And for the teachers that are just, that need that solid floor, create that for them.
Thank you, Dan. Before I go to Stacy and give her the final last word, I saw Denise mention we're putting up contact information. That's going to be up there in a slide momentarily. Stacy, going to go to you for the final word.
Yeah, so my final word is to learn something and do something. So whether it's investigating the programming that strong-minded, what that looks like, whether it is reading some of the resources we've shared, learning more about CASEL, and then do something with it from whatever seat you sit in, whether it is a classroom teacher, a counselor, model it with the people that you have direct impact and influence with, and watch it grow from there.
Thank you, Stacy. Thank you, Ivani. Thank you, Dan. Thanks for all who took part. We do have and I appreciate all the chatting going on, the questions and the comments. We do have the contact information for everybody up on that slide. We'll leave it up there for a couple of moments. And just want to thank everybody once again for joining us today. I'm going to sign off from Western Colorado. Hope to see you all again on a future webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good luck.